It's not that dog training itself isn't good or bad. It's clearly neutral. It just is. It depends on what the dog feels about it and what it does. But by convincing the general public that they must do dog training and they must have an obedient dog in inverted commas and think about compliance and the whole task stuff, there's no room there for the dog to tell their bit and to give the feedback, because everything is perceived as a training issue again. Or the dog hasn't done it, therefore I must train more, or they must do more. And that's where we have a problem, I think, and that's where we have the disconnect. So there's a huge amount to the dog's lived experience. And I think the beautiful thing about shifting to a care approach is, in my experience of working for quite a while with dogs and owners, caregivers, the vast majority, and I could probably count on one hand actually, of the people that I've met that I didn't think didn't care. It's just they're stuck in task. They're stuck in it. Oh, I just can't do it. And if my dog would only behave differently, everything would be okay. But so there you go. So the care approach then is very much about learning from the other first. That's all. And getting some of the foundational things right, focusing on things like emotions and mood state, and making sure the physical side of things, making sure that dog has been able to do the things that are internally valuable for that dog during their development phases up until 18 months, 2 years old, because the most important thing from a Mother Nature point of view is that we learn to self-regulate over time. And self-regulation isn't an innate skill. We have to learn it. And in fact, all juvenile mammals are designed to dysregulate. We know that, including ourselves, because of the way the brain forms. That bit of the brain that really helps us to hold it together doesn't come online till quite late. And in fact, we now know, we used to think it was in our mid-20s for humans, but now we think it might be even late 20s. And in dogs, it's about 18 months. So what's important in that first 18 months? Doing loads of training, it can't hurt. But a lot of the stuff that we teach the dog through transactional training has little or no value to the dog, actually, from their ability to be able to think, right, I need to process this world, I need to experience these emotions, and I need to find outlets so that I can decompress again. So I've got two little analogies here for the listeners, because for me, everything, and the beautiful thing about this stuff is, when we think about the emotional experience lens, which is the one that I love talking about it, I love using it, because there are two things about the emotional experience. One is we all have one. So the emotional experience is how you experience those emotions, mood states, how those feelings are processed, the things that are affected by, the things that you feel affected by. And secondly, so the dog has an emotional experience, the cat, the horse, we all have one. But secondly, they're unique to us as individuals. So us three in this virtual space, we all have a different lived experience. We could all be in the same place at the same time, experiencing the same thing, but be affected by it very differently. So the fact that we don't know how a dog thinks and feels, which is often the thing that people say, well, we don't know how they think and feel. Well, I don't know how either of you think and feel. So do I ignore that and just make you do stuff in a transactional way? So for me, then, there's two things that we all share. There's many things we share, actually. One is that with the importance of being able to process something and what that processing looks like. We can expand on that a little bit in a moment, because it's really important when we have, in inverted commas, reactive dogs. And secondly, what our nervous system decides to do. So two little analogies then. The first is, if we imagine the dog's brain has lots of little doors in it, and we need as many of those doors to be open for that dog to have a chance at free-flowing information, that sensory integration system. So sensory integration is just where we take on all the information through our senses, external senses, internal senses, and the brain tries to do something with it. Pain, trauma, and stress are big door closers. So this is really important. We're going to come back to that in a second. So when we think about the stress side of things, this is the good old bucket analogy, which people might have heard of, but it's a good one. It's crude, but it's good. So the bucket denotes that kind of nervous system, and the water in the bucket is how much that nervous system is kind of engaged, if you like. So for me, in the bucket, elevation, out the bucket, decompression. The more elevated, the more that's in the bucket, the less doors we have open, the less chance of having that mindful, rational, for want of a better word, response, more likely to dysregulate because we're overwhelmed, but most importantly, more likely to have an automatic response. And this is why we can sometimes, in the heat of the moment, when our bucket's too full, say and do things that we might regret or apologize for later. So this is a good one for anybody listening. You have a bit of a to-do with your partner. You can say, oh, I'm sorry, my bucket was a bit too full. But this is the point. It's hard. So this is framing now the answer to your question, Julia, because when that dog is being stubborn, willful, whatever else, they probably just haven't got enough doors open right now. And the doors that are open are more likely to be the ones that are intrinsically valued for them. So intrinsic just means internally valuable to the stuff, and that's invariably stuff that is to do with safety, especially social safety. So sometimes it can be because just the bucket's too full and they're too stressed. It can be because they're like, I'm already processing this. I can't deal with that at the moment. Now, this is really important when we think about dogs who struggle in the social environment. That's how I like to kind of put it, because I think how we term things really helps for our clients to understand it. Because if the dog is, in inverted commas, reacting to another dog or a person, then there is an element of social sensitivity there. There is something about the social environment that means that that dog is unable to data collect well, is more likely to flip into those threat circuits. And the problem there is when those threat part of the brain, threat evaluation part of the brain kicks in, by the very nature of that, the brain's seeking threat. And we're not data collecting, kind of, let me just work this out. So invariably then, they are already, doors are closing very rapidly for that dog. And this is why, even if we're asking them to do something in a training-y way around the trigger, we have to be really mindful that, are we stopping them from even doing the thing that they need to do? And this comes down to what we call foundational safety. So I can talk a little bit about that if you like, just to bring this in because it fits. And then because when we're in a well-regulated state, by the way, being well-regulated doesn't mean being calm. It can be, of course. Being well-regulated just means whatever you can feel in the moment, you can deal with it. You can what goes in your bucket, you can think, okay, I'm going to get my bucket drained again. For those who are medically, clinically minded or want a bit of geeky stuff, in the bucket, as the bucket raises, that's kind of sympathetic system, and then nervous system, and then out the bucket is parasympathetic, and the body wants to get back to homeostasis. And that's the whole point of having feelings and emotions, everybody. It's not a wishy-washy thing. It's the brain's way of saying, I'm going to make you feel something right now so that you can seek relief. And relief, that word relief, is, in my opinion, the most important word in the psychology of behavior. It's even more important than safety for me. Because if you can't find relief, then you won't feel safe. So it's a call to action. Emotions, feelings, especially those negative ones, they're kind of saying, this doesn't feel right, do something. So when we think about safety then, which is so important when we think about working with reactive dogs, I say in inverted commas, I won't keep saying that, but we all know that's just a word that we use, but it's just not, it's quite a reductive word, but that's the kind of word we use. We have a brain that is potentially not feeling safe for some reason. So safety is such an important thing for me. Safety first, actually, is how I always see things. And there are three aspects to safety. Now, when we think about safety, we will tend to have a bias when we think about safety in another person or a dog, as we tend to have a physical bias, a physical safety bias, because that's what our brain can get information back from. But what we know for ourselves, and now with the amazing MRI research for dogs, that the individual's brain is just as, if not more, focused on emotional safety and social safety. So this is why you can be safe physically and really not feel it. So we have to be mindful of that when we're thinking about, okay, how do I support my dog to feel safer then, not just to see it because they're physically safe. And also not to just see it that just because they're not giving a behavior that they're okay. No behavior doesn't mean a lack of a negative response, and equally big behavior sometimes don't necessarily equate to a big emotional response. But so this is important. So when we think about this then, if we break this up, when we think about trying to support safety in another, we need to think about the foundational safety stuff, and that's three important bits: processing, engagements, and exits. So processing is really important. The ability to process stuff, that's what we do. We have to process what's going on. And when you're quite well regulated, when you're relatively calm, when you're, when you're data collecting, a lot of that processing is done subconsciously. The vast majority of information that gets processed through sensory integration is done subconsciously, because it would be exhausting otherwise. But if you've ever experienced anxiety yourself, or you've been in a situation where you felt a lot of pressure, using that word, Julia, pressure, you will be really aware of your surroundings, and you're more likely to get overwhelmed with that processing. Because now you're processing in a more kind of a conscious way. So processing is really important. Huge amount of different things about processing, but it's important to be able to process them and think, okay, how do I feel about this? What does it mean for me? The second is engagement, having choice over engaging with the thing. We're talking very active dogs, so we're talking predominantly about social engagement, but it's the same about physical engagement, emotional engagement, mental engagement. It's just thinking about whether you have the choice to engage with that right now or not. And then exits. Exits are hugely important and powerful. I'm going to give you a great example in a minute. You need to know that if I do engage, that I can exit emotionally, socially, physically, mentally, whatever. Most trauma, when we think about it, if not all trauma, is based on lack of agency or choice over engagements and exits. You're in a situation you didn't want to be in, and you can't get out of it. And that can be the same even if you're stuck in a mental trap of something, emotional trap, So when we think about the dogs, then, we make a presumption with a dog who might bark and lunge at another dog that they don't like dogs or they're fearful of dogs. That might be the case. But actually, in my experience, that is the case for some, but for many, it's more nuanced than that. And you can see a situation that plays out again and again and again. If you have a more socially sensitive dog that needs more time to process, but then has a experience of engagement coming fast all the time, because everybody wants to touch you, because you're a cute puppy, dogs just run over to you, and lack of exits because you're on a lead. So it's no wonder then we start to see that dog often, there's a bit of a pattern, sort of, 6 to 12 months in that kind of area, when the more socially defensive brain starts coming, because that time, they're more likely to use fun appeasement, not always, but they're more likely to be like, hey, you're going to be a bit crazy now, because this is a bit too much, because I'm still learning. So processing is important. So our history of engagements and exits feeds back into processing again. It just so when I'm doing my observational work with the dogs, then I want to think from the moment I meet them, how do you process me? How do you process the environment? How do you process with your caregivers? What does engagement look like? How do you choose to engage with the environment? How do you choose to engage with this environment? What do those exits look like? Exits don't have to be big, I'm moving out the way. They can be just looking away. They can be just sniffing the ground. They can just be staring into space, all these kind of things. Because for many of the dogs I work with, actually, they don't have a problem with dogs per se. I'm sure that both of you found this yourself when working with dogs, when they've been able to decompress a bit and they've had a chance to process, and they've maybe had a sniff of a bum, or they've done something that they need to do. Okay, now I can cope better, actually, and I have more doors open that I can choose the exit. Because that's the rational thing to do, of course, isn't it? If you're not sure, walk on. But if their bucket's too full and they haven't got enough doors closed and their brain's already predicting engagement, so all this stuff's important, isn't it? I think when you start looking at it like this, it starts to, because what I would ask you to do now, the listener especially, is to think about yourself. So let's just give a little example here of this. Let's just say you're going to a party with a friend, and you're really looking forward to it. You know where you're going. You know the friend, all that stuff. So the processing done subconsciously. Brilliant. The engagement, you're not even thinking about it. In fact, you're quite excited about it. You have an optimistic bias about it, right? And you're at the party having a great time. But then you want to go home, but your friend doesn't. We've all been there, right? That's my husband normally, because he wants to stay till like early hours in the morning. I'm ready to go home by 10 o'clock. But just in that moment, the perceived lack of exit will stress you terribly. We can all relate. Now, you could just leave, but you're kind of conflicted, you want to say. So this is how much pressure and stress a perceived lack of exit can create. We've all been in situations where we had to engage with something that we didn't want to. We've all felt awkward. We've all felt overwhelmed. So it doesn't take much, actually, to start thinking, okay, maybe my dog's experiencing the same thing here, actually, and we need to work out stuff about what it is that this dog needs to feel safe, by breaking it down into processing, engagement, and exit preferences. And I think if you've got a dog who's like, do you know what, there's two in inverted commas diagnoses I look at. One is the level of social sensitivity in the dog. I have a little scale that I use on: mild, moderate, severe. So mild meaning the dog struggles a little bit around the trigger, but once they're processed, they can engage and they can actually socially engage, which is fine. Right up to severe, which is if the trigger's around, they just can't cope. There's no signs of them being able to do anything. The second thing I look at is how socially conflicted the dog is, because many of the dogs I work with, they kind of wanna be, but they just haven't had enough experience of it. Because think back to ourselves, especially when we're in our late teens, early 20s, it's really, many of us are quite socially awkward. When we're younger, we're less so, actually. So sub 7 or 8, the brain's kind of designed to do stuff. So we'll go over to that other kid in the playground and say, all right, do you want to play on the swings with me? We don't really think about it so much because the brain's saying, be sociable. But then it gets harder when all these other things come in. So some dogs, they just haven't had enough good experience, and or they've had some negative experience. So that makes it difficult for them, actually, because trauma, nothing shuts doors like trauma. Trauma literally rewrites the brain and affects everything, because those defense circuits only have to experience it once in that context to think, I can't do that again. So we've got to help the dogs navigate through these things. And if you've got a dog who isn't socially conflicted, as in, I just don't want to, I think we should bear witness to that and actually make it more about how do we give that dog enough resilience to cope with kind of managing through the social environment, but try and protect those engagements for them.